You're listening to the Emerald City Sportscast, presented by Hollywood and Vines Recording Studio. And now, here's Dan.
Happy draft day, everybody. Got to dispense with the long, drawn-out intro today because there's no Mariner talk, and we don't have time. We got to get right into this. It is draft day, and whether you believe the day holds as much meaning as normal as a Seahawk fan because they don't pick today, you're missing the point. Draft day is always fun. There's a lot of intrigue around the league, especially in the NFC West today. We'll touch on that a little bit. But we got a gift yesterday in the form of the first public appearance that John Schneider and Pete Carroll have made since the season ended. And there were a few things to talk about, a few things to ask them about. And to get some thoughts on that, we're going to bring in one of my favorite guests to the show, longtime Seahawks writer and author, Cluff. Chris, happy draft day. How you doing today, my friend?
Good, Dan. How are you doing?
Excellent. It's kind of sunny outside, and it's draft day, and I don't have to work tonight, so I can't ask for much more.
All good things.
Yeah, let's, as I mentioned, let's go back and kind of recap some things yesterday before we move forward. It was funny when the press conference came up, and they immediately addressed the fact that it was their first time to talk to the media since the season ended. That was kind of an eye-opener for me. I guess I had lost sight of that fact. Usually they talk around the combine. They have scheduled, usually John Schneider and Pete Carroll do separate press conferences around the combine, and we get to hear some thoughts then. No combine this year, no press availability. Yesterday was their first chance to talk. And without a first-round pick, with only 3 picks in the draft, a second, a fourth, and a seventh, there were other subjects that took center stage, most notably there were a few questions about Russell Wilson and what's happened over the last 3 months and some of the offseason drama. I've got some thoughts, but I want to hear what your thoughts were. What was your main takeaway from the way Carroll and Schneider answered those Wilson questions yesterday?
I think, like a lot of people, I think Pete was kind of protecting his quarterback. I think Russell Wilson might show up in the next whodunit as the dead body. You know, he's played the victim more times than not this offseason. First his people were calling him a victim, as Pete Carroll was the bad guy, and then yesterday, Pete was basically calling the media sort of the antagonist for Russell, who was Pete tried to paint it as Russ being the victim of the whole thing, and how people took his words and went with it with the speculation and all that. So I feel like that's kind of what Pete was trying to do. He's trying to he was following rule number 1, protect the team. So he's protecting his quarterback, and I feel that's pretty much what yesterday was about as far as those answers went.
It's interesting though, because I think Carroll's the master of saying something without saying it. And this is what we always usually love about the draft day or the pre-dawn, the draft day eve press conferences, is trying to kind of get those little clues and hints about what they're going to do. Because they usually, when you go back and look at it after the draft, you can say, oh, they kind of gave away their strategy there a little bit. Without a lot of draft picks to talk about, it was the Russell Wilson situation we had to try to parse. And I thought, even though he did what you're talking about, he still, I thought there were moments where he admitted in his own way, very subtly, he's the master of subtlety, that, let me put it this way. A lot of fans this morning and after the press conference were saying, see, I told you that it was nothing. It certainly wasn't nothing, and there were moments in there where Pete did indicate, in fact, he called it at one point, that he did say it got uncomfortable. In his own way, didn't he also kind of admit that, there were some trouble spots?
Yeah, I think he was pretty clear about not appreciating Mark Rodgers, Russell Wilson's agent, coming out and throwing those 4 teams out there. That was the thing I think that peeved Pete the most, because he really talked about how that created more conversations. Yeah. The more conversations being, Pete then had to talk to Russ about it, said he told Russ to be quiet, to just let it, just let this all go. John Schneider said he actually talked to Mark Rodgers about it. And of course, John Schneider was answering more phone calls from teams, the conversations that developed off of teams smelling blood in the water, thinking, maybe they are going to trade him.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that was the thing that really put it over the top. And that's pretty much the way Pete described it, was this is the thing that put it over the top and was unnecessary. I wish that hadn't happened. So you could tell the way he said that, he was really annoyed with Mark Rodgers for that. And, I think that's pretty much the nutshell of that.
I thought that was kind of the apex of the press conference, and I can't remember who asked that follow-up question, but it was a really good one where I thought Pete had made his case that he and Russ had communicated more than they ever have. His exact quote is, we've had as many conversations as we've ever had. We've talked extensively throughout the offseason, tried to paint that picture that everything's good, kumbaya, and we're moving forward. But then when he got that follow-up question specifically about the leak to ESPN about the 4 specific teams, you could see a change in his facial expression. You could see a change in his tone. And because he thought he had an understanding with Wilson that everything was going to be kept in office. And then it kind of went off the rails. And as much as you see Pete get upset, you kind of saw it there for a second.
Yeah, I agree. That was, to me, that was the thing that just kind of made it. I mean, and that to me, that seemed at the time like the thing that made this bigger than it would have been. It would have faded away as some frustration comments that maybe were, a little off base and said maybe in a mistimed way, especially considering Russell's offensive line in 2020 was maybe the best he's had in his career for most of last season. So to me, that was always weird that he just decided now to come out and express his frustration. But I also understood the buildup of how it happened, and the Dan Patrick sort of goaded him into candid answers that then he followed up that same day with local reporters, just kind of continued that theme.
Yeah.
It would have probably ended, and faded away if not for his agent then coming out on the heels of that athletic report same day, that basically kind of painted a picture of dysfunction between Wilson and the team. And then his agent, compounded that by, tossing this out there. And I think that's what extended this whole thing out and made it a bigger deal. And really that it did. I mean, it looked like a passive aggressive trade request. I mean, that's really what it came across as.
Yeah, in that way, the press conference, in a way, kind of mirrored what the offseason was like, because it was smooth and Carroll was getting his message out until that follow-up question, and then there was a little moment of intensity there. But it did seem that way for sure. And I thought Carroll did a wonderful job early on, before that point, of making just that point of, he didn't say they were never upset. He said, I was too, and I understood it. In that moment, watching the Super Bowl, seeing some of the things that were happening on the field, wishing we were there in the situation Tampa Bay was in, but also seeing the effect that Kansas City had with poor pass protection. I get it. I thought that was really well done, and I think overall they did what they had to do. They were honest as they could be. John Schneider even using the classic line of, I never actively negotiated with any teams, which doesn't mean he never sat at a restaurant in Fargo, North Dakota with Ryan Pace, and that Ryan Pace never made an offer. But I thought overall they did as much as they could without just shutting it down, saying we're not going to take questions, that's old news, we're not going to cover it. I thought they did okay. Yeah,
I was prepared for a lot of snarkiness, like they often have. They're usually snipe at reporters and things like that, just because they have these little inside jokes between themselves. And I felt like they at least met the moment with the seriousness that it required to discuss it, even if, you had to know that Pete was going to protect the team and that they weren't going to say anything that was really going to reignite anything. Yeah. So all of the peace that he's created with Russell Wilson over the last couple months, he wasn't going to undo that in one press conference. Sure. He was going to do what he did, protect his quarterback, not point fingers at his quarterback. He did say that he talked to Russ, a conversation had to be had, and it was had. I mean, he basically said a couple things similar to that. And the closest he came was the thing with the agent where he said, I wish that hadn't happened, which is a strong statement for Pete to make.
We'll have to remember this and look back on this, assuming Russ is going to spend the next 3 seasons here and finish out his current contract, when the next negotiations come around, because certainly some fences seem like they need to be mended between Mark Rodgers and the organization. I thought another interesting point that didn't get as much play is Schneider being really forthcoming about how they basically broke a lot of their rules and and the ways that they like to structure contracts. They don't like to take on a lot of future risk. They like to do short-term deals with real clear-cut guaranteed money. They don't like to do the voidable years and use those loopholes. But he was really upfront about how this was a different year. We didn't have a lot of cap space. We had to make moves. There were holes on the roster to keep up with the arms race in the NFC West. Were you surprised by that Schneider came out and was so frank about how this year in particular, we decided to use the void years, even though we may never do it again?
No, not really, because it was obvious that they did that, and it was obvious it was a new thing for the Seahawks, but it also was being done around the league during a really tight salary cap year. So I felt like he addressed it in a pretty generic way, saying, yeah, it's something we had to do, and probably won't do that too much in the future because we like to keep things current and not get too far ahead of ourselves. So I wasn't surprised by that. What I was more interested in was them going into more detail about the Jamal Adams trade and that Schneider actually had looked ahead last year. And I don't know if you saw it, but a couple of days ago, John Boyle for Seahawks.com put out a story about that with Trent Kirshner and Matt Berry. They're kind of their lead, Schneider's lieutenants. And they had basically talked about that, how John saw this ahead of time, looked at it, and John called it yesterday, this draft hazy, like unclear. They weren't sure what they were going to see based on how the college season was going to go last year. This was like before the season never got going or stop and go. So I thought that was really interesting how they really addressed that and said basically they bailed out on this draft on purpose. They decided to go with the veterans, and they ended up with Jamal Adams, they end up with Carlos Dunlap, they end up with Gabe Jackson. So 3 established, well-known, good starters for 4 draft picks they paid out for those guys. So that's why we sit with 3 picks right now, but they'll tell you they already made 3 picks,
Yeah, absolutely. And then, the giving up the one next year, it'll be interesting. It'll be an interesting conversation next year because, scouts are already saying and analysts are already saying that because so many players chose to take the extra year of eligibility and wait until things are more certain, that next year could be one of the deepest drafts we've seen in a very long time. So not having a first-round pick might not hurt as much. It was really interesting to hear him say that and how quickly they went to work after the season ended last year when the pandemic was starting, whereas they normally would take March, April, May kind of off and then get fired up in the summer. They went right to work again and started this decision process. Also made it sound, if you read between the lines, very, very clearly, especially when Schneider was asked about if they've talked about whether Jamal has indicated he'll play on his 5th-year option. He essentially said, we haven't even got to that point, which tells me they're actively working on this extension and that we might see something in the pretty near future.
Well, I think Pete, he kind of referenced we got a couple things coming.
Yeah, he did. I wanted to ask you about that too.
Yeah, I don't know if he used the word surprise. I can't remember exactly how he said it, but he said it in a way that in the next couple of days something else was going to happen. So it could be Jamal Adams. I tend to think that that's going to be a tricky negotiation just because Jamal's going to want over 18 mil. They're going to want to pay him like 16 to 17 mil. Yeah. I know unless they bridge that fast somehow, fine. The 5th-year option. It seems to me like Jamal Adams feels he has something to prove based on his interviews that he had just after the season. He had a couple interviews, and he just talked about coming out and proving himself and that. So I'm not sure if he's necessarily a holdout candidate, so to speak. Like I think that question was leaning toward, would he play on the 5th-year option? But yeah, it sounds like they definitely want to sign him. The question is, can they get to the numbers, and when will they get to the numbers?
I wanted to ask you about that comment. I thought that was interesting. And to me, in the moment when Pete said that about we have a couple of things coming you'll see over the next few days, it sounded like outside signings. I don't know if there's anything big. I think over the cap has them at about $7 million in effective cap space. You take away about 1.6, I think, for draft picks as they have their picks now. We know they worked out a running back last week, Deonta Foreman. There's the KJ Wright situation too, and this was one of the most interesting parts of the press conference. I thought. I want your thoughts first of all on there was some interesting tone and inferences there in how they addressed KJ Wright. Where do you think they stand with him?
Well, John Schneider was totally non-committal. I mean, he talked about the league. He talked about, we're in phase 2 of free agency. All the teams are getting into the draft now. So then these veterans like KJ will circle back around. Teams will circle back around to those guys. But he didn't say we'll circle back around to him. He said, he talked about how we thought he would be signed already because they have so many former Seahawk coaches spread around the league now. He figured one of those teams who knows KJ would scoop him up. But obviously nobody wants to pay KJ, which is really bad for him because he's coming off a great season. Yeah. And he does deserve to be paid at least what he made last year. And right now he's looking at like half that maybe, Yeah. So I do feel bad for KJ because he's a great player, great person. But that's a scenario that a lot of veterans like him are in right now. And then, Pete comes out and he said, well, he talked to him. Okay, that's cool. He just sat down with him. But that doesn't mean that they're necessarily –
KJ lives here.
Yeah, I mean, he said – I told him where we are, and I found out where he is, so we're in a good shape there. And, Positive Pete will always say it in a way that sounds like, oh, yeah, they're going to sign him. Yeah. But that is not necessarily what happens or is going to happen here.
Yeah, when Schneider said that, as you recapped, it sounded to me like the words could have just as easily been, well, he wasn't in our plans this offseason. We were planning to move on without him, and we didn't even think that we'd have a shot to get him back at a number that we were happy with. So we were ready to move on. And then when Pete said what he said, it sounded a little more like, yeah, we'll bring him back at some point if he wants to come back, but it's going to be at our number or else. It was interesting.
I think that's right, Ben. I think that's right.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the draft. It's, as we said, just 3 picks. The first one, 56 in the second round. I've gone back and forth so many times on what I think they'll do, and I've even tried to do, after years of covering these drafts, I've even tried to force myself to think about what they could do to totally shock me, because they always seem to shock us, right? They never do. Everybody wants them to pick a center in the second round, a guy that can start as a rookie, right? That would be the consensus. But they probably won't do that, right? What are your general thoughts on how you think they're going to approach this draft, given everything they said yesterday and how they've kind of encapsulated the challenges facing all the teams this year?
Well, I feel like John really does want to trade down. So I feel like he would be and looking at the way the board is, I mean, I've just kind of been comparing all the big boards. I always put together a composite big board on my site that I pull. And actually the Athletic's been doing that. So I actually just kind of pull theirs now because they pull from 50 boards. So, and that's just obviously they're media analysts and whatnot, but which can be very, as John said yesterday, look, he made a very big point of saying, we put together our board for our team. He always likes to say that. It's like he was preparing for a bunch of F grades in this draft by saying, look, we just draft for us. We don't grade and draft for the whole league. So just understand that, Anyway, I feel like, again, that's to your point of he's going to do something nobody thinks is expecting him to do. But I do expect him to get more than 3 picks. They're going to move down, and some of those like second half of the second round into the third, they all blend together. Yeah, I mean, you don't know what, like he said, John said yesterday. Teams just after the middle of the second round, it really becomes, it's very diverse as to how and disparate as to how teams see different players. So I think you could easily see them moving down even to the top of the third round before they make a pick, and add a fourth or fifth rounder or something like that. A couple more picks, so they have about 5. Say, if they're really aggressive, they can maybe get to 6. I mean, it depends on how far he wants to keep dropping, right? Yeah. But I feel like there are going to be chances for him to do that, and that he will take advantage of those, and that's kind of how it would start, is getting farther down to add some picks, and then from there, position wise, I would say corner is their number one need. Number one, because they just don't have any real proven guys there at all. Yeah. They're just kind of good guys that DJ Reed had a nice surprise season for them last year. Akello Witherspoon has some ability. And then beyond that, you're just kind of recycling Pierre Desir, hoping Trey Flowers might challenge a little better than usual. to take a big step. But you just hope. That's all hopes,
Yeah.
So I think corner is number one. Certainly, long term, they don't have anybody. They don't have a center or any tackles signed beyond this year.
Yeah.
So those are options. Those are big options. Defensive tackle, a 3-tech to replace Jaron Reed if they could find one. I know it's not a great D tackle class, but there are 2 or 3 guys in the 3rd round area or later maybe that might be there and they might snag one. So D tackle could be an option. Linebacker, they only got like 4 linebackers on their team right now.
Yeah.
So they need bodies there at the very least. So I could see them starting with a linebacker again. Just like last year. You never know.
Yeah, I hadn't studied the linebackers at all this year, and I kept thinking, as you just pointed out, that second round would most likely be offensive line or corner. As I tried to force myself, as I said this week, to kind of think outside the box, I ran a couple mocks this week, and a guy like Jabril Cox out of LSU was there in the second round. If a guy like that falls, that plays the weak side, that can run and cover, and he's long, kind of almost a poor man's version of KJ Wright when he came out, I could see them going that route, especially if they're not going to bring KJ back. I had also thought at one point that maybe they're not done trading picks for veterans, that because of the uncertainty of this draft, that once you get past that second round pick, rather than take a kid who's not going to play this year and that's just going to be a project, and with limited offseason again and virtual and all of that and limited development time, that maybe you can move, even if you trade down, pick up extra picks. Maybe that's kind of what Pete was alluding to as far as you're going to see some things in the next couple of days. Maybe they have some of those sort of worked out. My only hesitation on that point is they don't have a lot of cap space to work with, so they couldn't really bring back anybody that's making a lot of money. But I think about a guy like, you talked about wide receivers in need. I think about a guy like Anthony Miller in Chicago, who has been reportedly on the shopping block and might be a good fit in the Waldron offense. Do you think we still might see another trade for a vet?
Oh yeah, I think that anything's possible there. I think a couple things about trades. I'm thinking more. You talked about the depth of next year's draft, how deep it's going to be, and the Seahawks guys, Schneider's lieutenant, one of those guys talked about that. Said next year, I think it was Matt Berry, said next year's draft, because of all these, just like you said, all these guys who took advantage of the NCAA allowing them back in a year. Next year's going to be a really deep draft. Yeah. So I could see as they trade down, maybe one of the things they pick up as they trade down is a 2022 pick.
Absolutely.
Just kind of like, add more to that one as they're dropping down this draft. But yeah, I mean, it could be one of the things Pete's referencing is a trade, another veteran trade that they might be working on. You could be totally, spot on that one. Maybe they're just going to, trade as many of these picks from this draft for veteran guys as anything else.
I like something you touched on, though. The 2 tackles, obviously Dwayne Brown and Brandon Shell, unsigned beyond this year. There are some interesting left tackle prospects, some right tackle guys too, but those seem to be easier to find in a pinch. There seem to be a couple of interesting left tackle ideas that would be there where they're picking in the second round. Seahawks fans probably wouldn't like it, but how would you feel about basically taking a kid, a Walker Little, a Brady Christensen, someone of that ilk, a Dylan Radins, and redshirting him essentially, learning behind Dwayne Brown, setting yourself up potentially to succeed Brown moving forward in 2022?
Yeah, it's funny that you bring that up, because last night when I finally had some time, I preparing to, kind of going through more scenarios. That's one that I went through, was picking Walker Little, trading down to the top of the third if he slides that far. Because, one of the questions is going to be, how do teams view the opt-outs? How do and he didn't play in 2020, so he's been off for 2 years now.
Yeah, he barely played in 2019 after the injury.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep, exactly. So how are teams viewing those kind of guys? And would the Seahawks, bet on a talented guy like that who just doesn't have a lot of play time, behind him to this point? And I agree with you that a total, especially if their tackles, the left tackle will be a project, whoever it is for them, because there's only going to be, because like you said, there's a lot of right tackles, because left tackles get moved to right tackle, from college to the NFL. So for the Seahawks, where they're going to be, low second, mid third round, whatever it is, they are going to be looking at guys like that. Walker Little, maybe Brady Christensen, Dante Smith from East Carolina is another guy that is in that zone that I look at. And those really are the three guys that I think they would probably look at the most. Just kind of looking at their build, the length of arms. I guess Christensen's his arms are a little smaller. Rob Staten
they're borderline.
He's a move inside type of guy, which he might be. So maybe that brings it down to Walker Little and Deontay Smith. And those are your two options for the Seahawks where they are.
Yeah.
I think they'd have to stay there to get Raduns or Eichenberg or somebody like that.
Yeah, I really Radunz became my draft crush this year, and then right about that time he started shooting up boards. So I don't think he's going to be there. You had mentioned that you feel like corner's their number one need. If they take a corner with their first pick, it would be the highest they've ever drafted a corner under Pete Carroll and John Schneider. Give me a couple of names of guys that you like in that range that you think would fit.
I like Robert Rochelle's a guy that showed interest in from Central Arkansas.
Yeah.
But they also don't do small school guys, especially high in the draft. So I'm not sure how they would go for him. But Paulson Adebo, speaking of Stanford guys, Paulson Adebo, who opted out last year as well, similar to Walker Little, same kind of thing where he started out great at Stanford, and then now he's got a couple years of either not great tape in 2019 or a partial year, and then a nothing in 2020. I don't know if he opted out like shortly into the season, but so that would be a guy. Ambry Thomas from Michigan. He's got the length. Yeah. He's got the speed. That's the guy I keep every time I look at the big board and where the Seahawks end up down around in the fourth round. He's the guy who's always there for them.
Yep.
I'm not sure if that's really how it's going to turn out. Maybe he'll be drafted more like the third round because all of his measurables do match up. But that's another guy that I look at. And there's a bunch of corners. I can go down the list and all the size specs that they look for, the 32-inch arms.
Yeah, there's a lot of them this year.
Yeah, the size and speed guys, the length and speed guys that they like. There's a bunch of them and of varying experience and varying, technical abilities. So, it's just a matter of which ones they think they can coach to their scheme, I think. But, I think there's plenty of options there, which is why maybe they do wait till the fourth or fifth round on that, and they start out with a different position in the third round.
It's interesting you brought up Thomas. I was kind of late to the game on him. He was an opt-out kid too, right?
I can't remember if he opted out.
But the thing I like about him, you mentioned it, he meets all the measurables, good cover guy, not afraid to come up and hit somebody. And I wonder, too, in a year when, we've talked about it ad nauseum, no combine and limited tape, and it's harder to get a read on these guys. Pete Carroll has a great relationship with Jim Harbaugh at Michigan, and he leans on those relationships. He leaned on that relationship at LSU last year and taking Damian Lewis and some of his old contacts and Coach O and I could really see them going with a guy like Thomas, someone who's kind of been under the radar as far as Seahawk draft analysts have gone. You see a lot of Tyson Campbell, and you see a lot of Paulson Adebo, and you see a lot of Melifonwu out of Syracuse, who almost seems too perfect, too good to be true. Like he's too perfect of a fit for the long type corner that the Seahawks the Seahawks used to get. So of course they won't take him. But I see what you're saying. There are some interesting guys later on as well.
Ambry Thomas did opt out. I'm looking at that. He did opt out last year.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
He's got some great tape though. Really looks good. If you were to force yourself to speculate on what they might do with their first pick that would surprise the most people, outside of taking a running back, let's take that off the board because that's something they would always consider doing at any pick in the draft, no matter what their running back room looked like.
8 out of the last 9 years they've drafted a running back. Yep.
There you go. What's a curveball you think they might throw us tomorrow? Or tomorrow.
Well, we talked about linebacker, just because they're short on bodies and that position hasn't really been talked about in relation to them. So I could totally see that. Last year I remember when we talked, I said center. center would be the curveball. And and you know what? It should have been. It should have been, because look where we are right now, right? Yeah. So, I mean, I was talking about something they should have done, but, they didn't curveball that one, So, and I could see linebacker. I also could see, and maybe this is just me thinking about it, tight end, Brevin Jordan from Miami.
Yep.
He's a guy that I just like. I've watched his highlights and stuff. And the scouts are sort of all over the board on him a little bit about whether he's really NFL good enough, or some think could be a great NFL player. Some's like, well, he has a lot of work to do. So you get different takes on the guy, because he didn't have a very good workout at his pro day. He ran like a 4.66, and he just wasn't very and that probably that might keep him in the Seahawks realm of draftability. So, and I don't know. I know the Seahawks did contact him. He's on their list of guys that they've interviewed and talked to.
Yeah, early in the process.
Yeah, early on, and more than once, I think they talked to him. So he is a guy that expressed interest in. He is a guy that probably will be in that zone of late second to top third if they're interested. So I could totally see that being the so-called curveball you're talking about. Is Brevin Jordan a tight end?
Yeah.
And he instead of drafting a number 3 wide receiver, put him with Gerald Everett and Shane Waldron. Use those guys, and there you go. There's your third receiver right there. That tight end match, that combo. So possibly that. So I'd say linebacker or tight end. Those are your curveballs from me.
It's so funny you bring up Jordan, because I ran a bunch of mocks the last couple of days where I take him in the second round. My thought process was this. I think the curveball, and there really isn't a curveball they could throw, because you could make a case for just about any position on the field could be a need. But they're always trying to add weapons, and they really didn't poke around the wide receiver market much this offseason, even though there was a ton of guys out there. There was a little bit of Marquise Goodwin talk, and they tried to bring Philip Dorsett back, but there wasn't a lot of activity there. But I can't imagine that they're comfortable, as much as they say they like Freddie Swain, and there are some other guys that might be fits for this offense, Penny Hart, John Ursua, Aaron Fuller. I don't see them getting through draft weekend without adding another weapon. And there are some guys in the second round that at wide receiver that are intriguing, but none of them really seem to be true outside guys, and they already have a bunch of those inside guys, and that's what this draft is full of this year. And that's what brought me to a guy like Jordan. We know they contacted him. He's kind of a hybrid. He's not really a true traditional tight end. We've talked about Colby Parkinson maybe in the Waldron offense being used more as a big slot. I could 100% see them going with a guy like Brevin Jordan. But maybe the curveball is that they do take a center and surprise us all by doing the right thing.
The curve on the curve, yeah.
Maybe they just take Josh Myers or Quinn Miners and just call it good.
It's a reverse breaking curveball, right?
Yeah, right. And then the next day, people will be mad they didn't take a receiver.
Yeah, well, people get caught up in the skill positions a lot, and this year a lot of fans are really caught up in that number 3 receiver. To me that's a third or fourth need. I'd even put tackle maybe ahead of it. Because they have 2 stars, and Shane Waldron is going to. Cross our fingers, knock on wood. Shane Waldron's going to use the tight end. Hope. So I'd be good with Brevin Jordan is coming in. Double tight ends, put him in the slot as basically your number 3 receiver, or from number 4 behind Everett. Yeah. I'd be good with that.
I'm glad you brought that up. That was something I wanted to touch on, and I missed it. When they talked, it was the first time we got to hear from Pete and John, but mostly Pete after the Shane Waldron hiring, other than the official press release from the team. He talked in glowing terms about how smart the guy is, how good of a communicator and teacher he is in trying to install this offense over the last couple of weeks in the virtual offseason program. I think his exact quote, he said he has a great brain. He never said things like that about Daryll Bevell and Brian Schottenheimer. He almost talked in reverent terms about Shane Waldron. And then specifically, and I felt like this was maybe a little message to Russell too, he talked more than once, kept going back to it, about how this scheme and how he's fitting it with what they've done before, and for it to be successful and when Russell operates most effectively is when they're getting the ball out quick. I thought he really made it a point to make sure that we heard him say that.
Yeah. I mean, he's basically said talking about throwing in rhythm. And, he said a big focus is about the rhythm and the rhythm of the ball coming out. That's commitment to helping pass protection, which is totally true. You and I have talked about this before.
Yeah.
Wilson's got to get the ball out fast. That will help his O-line. They got to move him around, mix the protection. He's got to read it and throw it fast, and Russ has been a good rhythm thrower most of the time, but like Pete said, I've always felt he's at his best when we're really quick with the football and it's coming out of his hand in a hurry.
Yep.
So, I mean, that hopefully that, it's good to hear that that's what Shane Waldron's doing, because that's what you and I expected him to do when we talked about him. We talked about it right after he was hired earlier this year. And that's one of the things we talked about right there.
I broke into a huge smile when I heard Pete say that, like go out of his way to say that. I have one more note here that I missed. When we were talking about Waldron, and I just lost it. In reference, a couple of things. When Pete said, and we've gone over this a couple of times, there's some things coming in the next couple of days that you'll see. He also, when the question of Aldon Smith came up in his legal status, and they said they couldn't comment on it, the legal proceedings are continuing. He said, he slipped in a little comment where he said, we're always looking for pass rushers and we're not done.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder if we also might be seeing another addition there, and maybe those two comments go together. There are still some interesting guys left on the free agent market. Melvin Ingram hasn't signed. Ryan Kerrigan hasn't signed. Has Justin Houston signed? He's talked to a couple of teams, but I don't think he has. There are still some guys out there.
I don't think he has either, yeah.
It took him 3 years too long, but have you been more pleased or more surprised with how much attention they've paid to the pass rush this offseason?
I'm really glad they got Carlos Dunlap back, because I was less concerned about what they were going to pay him, because but everyone was talking about, well, you can't pay him the $14 million or $10 million. You can't. He's going to be down there in the $7 million zone, which is what they got him for, as it turned out. But that was fortunate that he wanted to come back. That Russell was kind of recruiting him, or he talked to Russell, and confirmed, you're going to be our quarterback, right?
Right.
Yes, I'm here to stay. So all that sort of came together, fortunately, because he is the answer to this 3 off-season long, quest that they've been on, and I'm glad that they have him for a couple years. And then they added Kerry Hyder, which is great. They've got Benson Mayowa back, and he's going to be more of the rotation guy. You and I talked about last time how he's overused last year, and he's meant more to be in that rotation. And Aldon Smith to me was kind of a cheap luxury addition. Unfortunately, 2 days after he signs, he goes and does something dumb. So, odds are he's not going to be with them. I mean, that's just the odds based on his history and what the NFL probably will do to him, even if he doesn't end up in jail. So that's unfortunate. But I feel like they've stacked their D-line. And I feel like when Pete said that, I was thinking more of the interior pass rush and what they might get in the draft. I was thinking of those 3 tech guys that we were talking about, potentially them getting those guys. But you're right, it could be another veteran signing afterward. But when he said that, we're leading into the draft. So my mind was immediately on the draft when he said that maybe they're looking at some specific 3 tech guys to replace Jaron Reed, because they don't really have an interior rusher unless you're creating that with LJ Collier, Rasheem Green, maybe putting Hyder or Dunlap inside with other guys outside. I mean, obviously they're hoping Daryll Taylor, and they talked, of course, Positive Pete will talk positively about a guy in the offseason, but he talked positively about Daryll Taylor.
Did he though? Because what he said was, if everything continues to progress, he should be ready to go. That sounded strange to me, considering he was supposedly 100% ready to go during the playoff week, and they just decided not to act. I thought that was a strange comment.
I think that might be more of reflecting his disappointment about last year, and being cautious about it, because really the read last year was that, and if you read and you kind of understood what Pete was saying, he was always saying he's ready to go. but he doesn't feel comfortable. So he always put it on Taylor, that Taylor did not feel comfortable with his leg, and that's why he wasn't on the field. Okay. It's that because he said, our doctors say he's ready to go, but he's not comfortable with it. Yeah. So I think he was frustrated about that last year, that he never got on the field. And I think the way he talked about him yesterday was more of if he is willing to do it, if he is ready to do it. Because I think Pete thinks he's ready to go. I mean, that's my take on it.
Yeah. Well, trying to decipher and interpret what those guys are actually saying is one of the most fun exercises for those of us who cover the team. And you do it as well as anyone, Chris. I appreciate your insight, and thanks for coming on the show with me. And enjoy the draft. I mean, take the night off tonight if you want. Oh, let's hit this. Yeah. I'm as interested in this draft as I have been in a long time, regardless of the fact the Seahawks don't have a first-round pick. And it's because of, to me, the most interesting thing about this draft is what's going to happen at number 3. We've gone from, ever since the 49ers moved up, Seahawks division rival, it's 100% Mac Jones because they want a guy that can play as a rookie even though his ceiling's not as high. Then the last week or so it was, they've fallen in love with Trey Lance and his ceiling. And now it's Justin Fields. What do you think's going to happen at number 3?
Oh, my. I don't know because, frankly, I haven't looked at those quarterbacks. And, I don't consider myself a draft guru or anything. I really look at what the analysts do, like professional analysts. I love to follow Rob State and Rob Rang, Tony Pauline, guys like that, Dane Brugler, Lance Zierlein. Those are guys I look at. Like they do that, So, and when the Seahawks are not really involved in any of that, I always look at it on periphery if the Seahawks might be trading out. Like, say, Teddy Bridgewater, back in 2014, they traded down Paxton Lynch for Denver.
We haven't had to scout quarterbacks in a while.
No, exactly. And, and Schneider's been remiss, as he said, in not drafting any. But yeah, so I haven't really looked at those guys. But, yeah, I mean, they obviously went up for a guy. Yeah. Like, to say you just went up there just because, that's not what happened. They went up there for a guy, and it sounds like Mac Jones was their guy. Yeah. And then they started looking at these other guys, and now they have some interest in those guys. But, I wouldn't be surprised if it is Mac Jones, which a lot of people would say, what are you doing that? That's a terrible pick. But, who knows? Who knows? The 49ers are a very interesting team because if they trade Jimmy Garoppolo and end up going with their rookie,
that's a lot to ask.
It is. Yeah. I mean, they do have a really good defense, and a lot of guys coming back to their defense. So,
it's a good situation for a rookie for sure.
It would be. Yeah. They'll be an interesting team to keep an eye on what they do. Definitely, probably the most dramatic team right now heading into the draft. Yeah. Because of this question. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a really good way to crystallize it, that when the trade was made, they had all the information they needed on Mac Jones. Lance and Fields, those evaluations have come later. They hadn't had their pro days yet. And so that's what makes the most sense. And when you look at Kyle's history and his father Mike's history with quarterbacks they've been involved with drafting, he fits more of that mold. He is a guy that seems to be more ready to go as a rookie. It is a good situation to throw a rookie into. If whoever it is, but especially if it's Mac Jones, and that would be considered the chalk pick, I guess, at this point. Then all the intrigue shifts to the Falcons, and will they take a quarterback to groom behind Ryan, and then it goes from there. It'll be interesting, and we just won't have a war room camera to watch this year from Seahawks headquarters. If we do, although the cardboard cutouts, I guess, will be there.
That was a fun intro to their press conference yesterday. The cardboard cutouts, yeah. They put one of Jamal Adams in their draft room, if they want to.
There you go. Well, we'll check in a couple of weeks, and we'll look back on everything that happened and review all this, and get ready for the season. It's coming up quick. Thanks again for joining me, man.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Appreciate it.
Yep, stay safe out there. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, take care.
All right, Chris Cluff, longtime Seahawks writer, has written a couple of books, too, with some great stories from old players and coaches. You can find those on Amazon. It's Chris, C-H-R-I-S, Cluff, C-L-U-F-F, and you can read his great Seahawks website, Chalk Talk. It's C-H, Seahawk, C, the letter C, H-A-W-K, Talk. That's going to do it for me. Again, enjoy the draft. We'll be back to wrap all this up next week and break down all the moves and trades if there are any. I will try to hop on this weekend and give you quick reaction to day 2. whether there's one or two picks for them, and then we'll wrap it up next week. Also, if you're a fan of the Hawks Playbook podcast with Bill Alfstad and Keith Myers, and you should be. If you haven't checked it out, do. I'm going to hop on with them on Monday for a draft recap show. That should be posted Tuesday, so you can check that out as well. In fact, I'll actually be on their show before I post my draft recap show, so I guess in that way I'll be competing against myself. But great podcast from those guys too, so check that out and listen to that as well. That's going to do it for me. I always mess this step up right here. Let's get some music going to finish this out. Enjoy the draft. Go Seahawks. We'll talk to you next week.